Well, let's turn our attention now to the press preview and what is making tomorrow's front pages. Joining us tonight are the political editors of The Guardian and The Sun, Pippa Crerar and Harry Cole. And let's see then what's on some of those front pages for you. In the Express pictures the new king with his head bowed in front of the late Queen's coffin at today's vigil in Edinburgh. Their headline, "Lost in Grief for Darling Mama." The Metro remarks on the King's vigil. And The Sun has an identical headline. Likewise, the Eye says, "Vigil for a Mother." The Mail calls it a silent vigil for a Queen and a mother. And that guard of honour is the main focus for the Telegraph as well. And here's the Mirror, their headline, "We will watch over you." And the Times opts for an exterior shot of today's proceedings in Edinburgh, describing the royal family as united in grief. According to the Star, people who queue to pay their respects to Her Majesty on the funeral route here in London could be made to wait for up to 30 hours. And away from royal matters, The Guardian reports that an emergency budget is expected at the end of next week to lay out more details of how the government plans to avoid a winter energy crisis. And the Financial Times hears that the new Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, is poised to tell the Treasury to focus entirely on growing the UK economy. Well, let's speak then to Pippa Crerar and Harry Cole. Now, we featured both of your papers there, so let's start, Harry, with yours, The Sun, and it is the King's Vigil.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to note that all the papers seem to be now moving towards, instead of putting the late Queen on the front, it is the King. It's looking to the future. It's entirely sort of Charles-led coverage now. Obviously, you know, those initial days of mourning, papers had, you know, sort of years almost to prepare features and magazines and pullouts, and now we're really into sort of live news. And I think it's interesting, and you know, Pippa and I will look at these things in much more detail than most punters, but it really is a picture-led story now. The grief etched on the King's face there, the pictures of the crowds, the whole pages of the newspapers, and not just the tabloids, which are traditionally picture-led, but the broadsheets, the front page of the FT, for example, big pictures you're seeing now. And they kind of say it all. This is like a moment we've all prepared for in the back of our minds, but we'll never be able to sort of escape those really incredibly stark images that just keep getting sort of almost more emotional as the days go on.
And Pippa, I mean, it is quite astonishing to hear, we heard it from our royal commentator, Alistair Bruce, that the tradition of the royal family, members of the royal family themselves, standing vigil over the coffin dates back only, I mean, given the thousands of years nature, or hundreds of years nature, of some of the ceremonial, this only dates back to the 1930s.
Yeah, and it happened when the Queen Mother lay in state. Senior members of the royal family then, Prince Philip and his sons, stood at the four corners of her coffin in Westminster Hall, which is, of course, where the Queen will lie in state, the late Queen will lie in state when her coffin is brought down from Edinburgh to London tomorrow. It will spend the night in Buckingham Palace and then will move to Westminster Hall, which is the heart of the Palace of Westminster, and where today we saw the new King and his wife, the Queen Consort Camilla, be received by the two speakers of the House of Lords and the House of Commons, and they paid tribute to his mother and then also to him. And it was, a ceremony, as so many of these that we've seen, with a military presence, with real sort of like sort of pomp, and there was the music, and it was a very beautiful ceremony in a very ornate setting. But then obviously he travelled back up to Edinburgh, and there you've got your images of the Queen's coffin, the late Queen's coffin, in St Giles Cathedral on the High Street in Edinburgh, my home city. And tonight, Scots queuing right down the Royal Mile by the looks of things, to pass through, to walk through, to pay their respects to the coffin as well. So while Harry is, of course, right, the focus is switching to the new king. There's still obviously a nation grieving, and many people wanting to pay their respects, and that will continue over the coming days, right up until her funeral next week.
Indeed. Let's just take in another of those front pages, as you're saying, some quite remarkable pictures. This is on the Telegraph, which also focuses on what is going on in St Giles Cathedral. It is the Guard of Honour in the Telegraph. And a different shot, but direct. And Harry, it was this, some people remarking on, it seems slightly strange that they're the king, and of course his two brothers and sister as well are at other parts of the catafalque there, but then members of the public just walking past, almost looking at them, almost, I mean, there's a slight element of Madame Tussauds about it.
Well, I think it's actually, it's remarkable how, how human it is, really. You've got, as you say, members of the public, and then you've got the grief etched on the face of Charles there, but doing his duty. I imagine the last place, he'd want to be is under the full glare, but he's doing that regardless, in a really strange way, and without sounding at all morbid in this. The fact that the Queen died in Scotland, I think, has given Edinburgh and Scotland an entire part in this ceremony, which they wouldn't have had the Queen died, say, at Sandringham, as other monarchs have, or at Windsor. And in a way, I think the family appear to be not using that as such, but taking full advantage in a good way to allow as many people from different parts of the country to be part of those proceedings. So I think it's amazing that the King is standing there in Edinburgh, and I think it's a shame actually that tomorrow the coffin will be taken onto a plane and flown to London rather than the original plans, which I understand were shelved at the beginning of the pandemic, to have the royal train very slowly going through parts of the country where other people in perhaps the middle of the country would be able to pay their respects, in the way the people of Scotland are turning out tonight, in the way that we're expecting millions of people in the south to turn out, and in London. But there's a feeling perhaps there's almost a missed opportunity for that coffin to be sort of taken slowly, so other people in other parts of the country will be able to pay their respects in the same way. But again, it's a sort of moot debate now. It's set in stone, but perhaps on reflection, it could have been done in a slightly sort of broader way. And I wonder whether some of the plans that have been dusted down in the last 48, 96 hours perhaps underestimated the number of normal members of the public that would like to be involved. One of the versions of the plan I saw suggested that only 40 to 50,000 people a day would want to come to Westminster Hall this week. And that's looking like it's going to be out by a factor of at least 5, possibly 10.
Yeah. I mean, we're seeing that, aren't we? Perhaps in microcosm, Pippa, taking place in Edinburgh this very moment as we take those live shots inside St Giles Cathedral. Just this constant flow of people, and we know it's going to be like that throughout the night until they close the cathedral and move the coffin.
Yes, that's right. And, the scale of interest and the sort of desire amongst the Scottish people to come out and pay their respects, I think we'll see replicated in London. There'll be when the Queen Mother lay in state about 15 years ago in Westminster Hall, it was open all night. And so there will be the opportunity for people to parade through and to do that, really into the wee hours, both there in Edinburgh but also later on in London. And I agree with Harry. It's a shame that circumstances of her death has enabled this opportunity for the people of Scotland to be involved in all of this in a way that they would not otherwise have been. And it is a shame that that possibility is not going to be available for other parts of the UK. Although I'm sure lots of people will travel to London. It's one thing that's really struck me about all of this is the planning obviously has been going on for decades, probably, given the late Queen's age. And there's been lots of rehearsals. Harry will know as well, having spoken to people in Whitehall about this, that they've frequently rehearsed what would happen at this moment. And here we are seeing this great plan finally bearing fruit. And it does feel that lots of these eventualities have been considered to give people these opportunities to come out and sort of share their grief with. Share their grief over the Queen's death with their friends and their neighbours and their colleagues, their fellow Edinburghers in this instance, fellow Scots. And I think there's a real sort of collective, it feels like a real collective endeavour, doesn't it? That people, whether they're royalists or not, actually, it's not even necessarily about how they view the monarchy. It's also, I think, about witnessing a moment of history. This is a moment that we've all anticipated all of our lives, and we all knew that it would come at some point. But it's incredibly poignant, and to be able to be granted the access, I think, to a moment like this in this way, I think a lot of people will, whatever their views of the monarchy more widely, will want to come and pay their respects to the Queen as a person, and also to, like I say, to have that sort of front row seat on history, something that they will be able to tell their children and grandchildren in years to come.
And let's just take a look at the front of the Mail. Similar scenes, slightly different headline. But on that issue of numbers and when the coffin arrives in London, Harry, well, let's imagine the numbers we're talking about. You said some of the planning was for only 40 or 50,000. Well, one imagines it's going to be multiplied by something like a factor of 10, if not more. I just look behind me now. I'm standing outside Buckingham Palace at approaching 11 o'clock, and just this constant stream of people still being funneled through. A very efficient system being set up here with the barriers and the one-way systems and blocking off bits to get things ready for events over the next few days. But still, a constant stream of people coming to leave flowers, inspect the flowers, look at the front gates of Buckingham Palace. And we are hearing, something like 24 hours, 30 hours in the queue to see the coffin in Westminster Hall.
Absolutely. I mean, one of my favourite things about the Vox Pops was going back to Pippa's point just very quickly about people that might not consider themselves monarchists or great advocates of the royal family or the system, but have on Sky, on BBC, or elsewhere have done interviews where they've said, actually, I just felt a need to be here. I just needed to be here, and in a weird way, it's sort of people are awakening in that they are monarchists and they are royalists. They just haven't really thought about it in the way that those labels, which have been slung around a little bit over the last few years as sort of traditional fuddy-duddy or old-fashioned, and actually it's a sort of a rejuvenating experience for the monarchy in the fact that seamless transition of power is something literally a wonder to behold, and people want to be close to it. So I think we'll be seeing some extraordinary scenes over the next sort of 96 hours. Some of the plans I've seen involve 3 to 5 mile queue, an average waiting time of perhaps 12 hours. We'll see wristbands, so people will be able to sort of tag in and tag out to get some water to relieve themselves, to get food. But the expectation is be careful, because you are going to be queuing through the night potentially, and the Westminster Hall will be open 24 hours, and I think that we're going to really see some extraordinary scenes. Obviously, behind that, there's a massive security operation going on. We do live in a troubled world. Something awful could, touch wood, won't happen. But thousands of policemen have had their leave cancelled, have had their overtime, are on overtime, have their weekends. Not many complaints about that. We've got about 1,500 members of the armed forces on standby. It's going to be, the British state gearing in and kicking into something we haven't really seen in London since the Olympics.
And let's just go back to, not just Edinburgh today. I want to take in the Metro here, if we can get this up, because, there's a lot of discussion, some controversy about those that want to make, some points about monarchy. A bloke we interviewed today who'd shouted out at the reading of the proclamation in Oxford who voted for him, and there's one heckler arrested in Edinburgh, Pippa, for calling the Duke of York a sick old man. Clearly freedom of speech is something that Her Majesty would have supported. But there's this issue of whether it's appropriate at this time, isn't it? And indeed at that place.
I think there's two separate things here, and we need to be careful not to confuse them. The first is whether it is the decent or appropriate thing to do to shout out at a funeral or in a procession like this when people are mourning. Many people would feel that it's not appropriate and that actually there's a time and a place for this sort of protest. However, the second aspect of it, of course, is that we need to be careful not to sort of blur it with what is legal and what is not. And of course, as proponents of free speech in this country, defenders of free speech, I think has to be an acceptance that you might not necessarily agree with or like what people are protesting about, but they have a right to do it. So, like I say, there's two very different arguments there, and we need to be careful not to cloud them. I think where some concern has arisen has been a feeling that in some cases, not in all, of course, the police are slightly overstepping the mark. There was a video earlier, of course, in Westminster of a barrister who was holding aloft a blank piece of paper and was asked to move on by police, and some of this was caught on camera and then went viral online. And the Met Police have insisted tonight, have issued a statement saying that the public absolutely have a right to protest during the days following the death of the Queen. I think most of us would agree with that it's obviously anybody's right to do so, but I think also most people would, I guess, feel that it was important to sort of bear in mind that while they may have their very strong, almost political views on matters like this, no matter if they're very strong Republicans, for example, that others might be offended by it, and that they need to take into account whether it's appropriate to do that. But like I say, there's two separate issues: what's illegal and what's appropriate or inappropriate in this case, potentially, shouldn't really be blurred.
Yeah, and what do you think, Harry? I mean, there's no one denying that people have the right to express these sentiments, but it's kind of at this time, isn't it?
Yeah, there's an issue of decency. I suspect that young chap who shouted at Andrew on the Royal Mile was quite appreciative of the police getting the hell out of there pretty quickly, because that mob were looking like they were going to give him a good old hiding if the coppers hadn't have been there. With the guy in Westminster as well, look, those gates, don't forget that was the exact scene of the Westminster terror attack in 2017. Those gates are occupied and busy and live throughout the day. I've made the mistake of standing outside those gates trying to hail a taxi, and within about 8 seconds the cops were shouting at me and screaming, whistles, moving on. There's perfectly places to protest 10 feet away. So again, as Pippa said, there's a difference between what's illegal and what's appropriate. What I would say though is in the last 2 or 3 years we have seen ridiculous overbearing policing in this country of free speech issues. Where were these people that, there's lots of lefty MPs who don't like the royal family anyway, jumping on these tiny cases? But where were they when, an army veteran was arrested for retweeting Lawrence Fox because it might have upset someone? Where were they when all these other ridiculous times the police have turned up at people's houses for things they've tweeted? If this triggers, in the long run, perhaps a conversation about the Overbearing Public Order Act of 1986, or the fact that the police seem to be, in recent times, doing more to police free speech than perhaps some, burglaries, for example. Great, let's have that conversation. It's long overdue, but can we just not have it this week? Let's give it a rest for a few days, because where were you when this has been going on for the last few years?
OK, well, let's talk about something that would have been happening this week. Pippa, it's your reporting in your own paper on an emergency budget. I think they're going to call it a fiscal event, aren't they? Not use the budget word, but it would have, we imagine, been happening this week, but it is going to happen pretty soon after the funeral.
Yes, so obviously we've got the funeral on Monday, and then Liz Truss is expected to go to the United Nations, to New York for the United Nations General Assembly, and then to come back in time for this fiscal event, which we're expecting most likely to be next Thursday, but it could be Friday, depending on whether the Speaker agrees to push back the start of the conference recess. I think we'll, regardless, see the conference recess limited at the other end, and MPs come back a week earlier than they were originally planned to do so. But it's another example, really, of how the early days of Liz Truss's new premiership have been so derailed by the Queen's death, and that there's nothing, obviously, that anybody can or would want to do about that. But it is a sort of as political watchers, as Westminster watchers, it's sort of interesting for us to see. Her big energy announcement was billed as really a sort of a make or break moment in which the tone of her premiership would be set. If she got it right, if it landed well, then her MPs felt that it would buy her some more time. If it didn't, then potentially that was the beginning of the end of her premiership, which had barely started. Obviously, that was all overshadowed by the Queen's death. And then the events of this week have meant that Parliament has been suspended. And that government, the business of government anyway, while ongoing, is very sort of low key and there's not any big announcements. Now, Liz Truss had a sort of a policy plan, a policy blitz for the first few weeks in power, and the number 10 aides have had to rip that up and start again. So this is the next big moment, if you like, which has been delayed as a result of this week. We'll obviously hear, as she promised throughout the campaign, details of her national insurance cut, the reversal of the increase in national insurance. We might hear some more about corporation tax and some other measures to help support businesses through the economic storms ahead. But what everybody is really keen to find out is a bit more detail about this energy plan, because even though she announced it, there was very little detail on how it would support, for example, businesses or the public sector, schools and hospitals, for example, dealing with soaring energy prices. And there was also very little detail on how exactly it'd be paid for. So those are some of the questions which Kwasi Kwarteng, the Chancellor, is going to be expected to answer in that statement. And it's really sort of the beginning of a resumption, if you like, of politics as normal, as politics as usual, after this period of mourning. Because, of course, while many people feel very profoundly about the late Queen's death and want to be able to celebrate her life and remember that, there's also, let's not forget, an economic crisis underneath all of this, which with many people struggling with bills already and likely to get worse over the winter, and the government will be acutely aware of the requirement at that point, when they judge that the mood is right, to sort of get back to the really urgent business at hand.
OK, and really will be back to earth with a bump. We've got the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee, haven't we, meeting on Thursday week as well, and may raise interest rates by something like 75 basis points. Pippa, Harry, for the time being, thank you very much indeed. I know you're coming back to join me in the next hour. But